safer. We'll just quickly make the changes on the dais and we move on to our next session, Actions for Global Economic Recovery. And we've got a fantastic panel that will join us any moment now. Please remain seated, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, our next session focuses on actions for global recovery. In the light of the evolving global economic landscape, governments worldwide must prioritize establishing financial resilience to mitigate heightened recovery risks. Bolstering financial protection strategies and instruments is vital to safeguard against future economic shocks and disasters. This session will focus on these matters, emphasizing the need for innovative finance to ensure a stable recovery. And as discussants, we have with us Mr. Charles Rick Johnston, Chair of the Executive Board Business at OECD and Managing Director, Global Government Affairs, Citibank, USA. Mr. Marc-André Blanchard, the Executive Vice President and Head CDPQ Global and Global Head Sustainability, CDPQ Canada, Mr. Dilhan Pillai Sandrasegara, the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer, Temasek, Singapore, the Managing Director and Chief Financial Officer, World Bank, Ms. Anshula Kant, and Lord Karan Bilimoria, Vice President, Confederation of British Industry and Chairman, the Cobra Beer Partnership Limited. To moderate and steer this session, we've got with us Mr. N.K. Singh, co-convener, G20 Independent Expert Group on Reforms in Multilateral Development Banks, President, Institute of Economic Growth, and former chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, Government of India. Ladies and gentlemen, our session with Mr. N.K. Singh steering it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's a real privilege for me to have been invited to this important session of B20. I'm grateful to the B20 Secretariat, particularly grateful to Mr. Chandrasekharan, who has been of such enormous value to the work of my own complex issues of the reform of the international financial architecture and the Multilateral Development Bank. Thank you very much, Chandra. As I look to the broad landscape of the sort of issues we are grappling with, I want to make three very brief comments before I'm going to really ask a very rich panel to make their initial observations and, time permitting, some interaction thereafter. So I think that it doesn't require too much of domain expertise to realize that the world faces unique challenges. They are multiple. One of the most important challenges is to achieve high rates of economic growth, sustainable high rates of economic growth, inclusive high rates of economic growth, and to be able to do so in a manner which addresses the enveloping crisis of what Mr. Larry Summers and I have called in our article, jointly written for Project Syndicate, to say the world is on fire. If the world is on fire, how much of resources does it require to extinguish that fire? And what does that fire emanate from? It emanates from slow rates of economic growth. It emanates from the hangover of the pandemic, from the fragility of countries, of uneven growths across continents, and the looming crisis of global public goods and transboundary challenges. Back of the envelope calculation suggested to us and our group that we roughly need $3 trillion a year, every year, between now and 2030 to address this. Out of that, for good or for bad, we assumed the $2 trillion will come from the country's own domestic resources through better economic policy, to processes which foster growth, to improve governance, and to, of course, increase the tax buoyancy. So that leaves $1 trillion. How do I get $1 trillion? $1 trillion, we have assumed $500 billion comes from private sector, which I'll come to in a minute. And $500 billion come from sources which are concessional and non-concessional involving public capital. So currently, to give you a ballpark number, how much does the world generate in terms of this kind of financing? From an architecture where on top of the line you have the multilateral development banks, all taken together, roughly speaking per annum, they are able to lend in 2019, leaving us out the high pandemic years, roughly speaking $120 billion a year is the overall lending capacity so far of the World Bank Group and all multilateral development banks taken as a whole. So the challenge before my committee, of which I have submitted the first part of the recommendation, is how do you take this figure of 120 billion to close to 400 billion and to be able to get the balance from private capital? And what needs to be done to mitigate the risks of private capital? what kind of risk mitigation or private capital would avoid the moral hazard question that the returns expected from the private capital are far too high, so the risks are public, the gains are private. And what kind of a balancing mechanism will be able to avoid this kind of a moral hazard question is one of the issues which we are grappling with. The other issue we are grappling with is forms of capital, innovation of capital, hybrid capital, blended finance, risk mitigation for private sector. What would it do to be able to garner and encourage, incentivize, and catalyze private flows? So as I look to this very distinguished panel, I'm going to pose this very important question, since all my panelists, including in some ways Anshula, who of course has worked an experience of the State Bank. She's the managing director of the World Bank Group, very important financial position. She, of course, has seen it from multiple perspectives. But I'm going to pose this first question. If you could think of a 5 minutes initial remark, for which I urge you to, on the broad issue that how does one garner adequate interest and adequate innovative arrangements of financing. I emphasize innovative arrangements because can you look for public-private partnership? Since this is the B20, and since this is also India's G20, what kinds of innovative financing mechanisms would be able to garner both public and private capital, where in the end it is an inevitable game? So my first distinguished panelist is Mr. Charles Rick Johnston, who is the chair of the executive board of business at the OECD and managing director of the global government affairs of Citibank. It's all yours, Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Test. There we go. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation because as I sat through the sessions earlier this morning, it's quite clear that all of the solutions that we need to talk about and the issues that are confronting us today ultimately find their roots in how can we finance it. I know that sounds a bit biased, but I do think that is why this panel is so significant, so important. As Mr. Singh's pointed out, the challenges are mind-boggling. When you consider the gap, I've just read some statistics that said that for us to reach net zero by 2030, there's going to have to be an expenditure of $23 trillion. I mean, these are numbers that I think all of us have a pretty hard time grasping. And it's that private sector component that's quite clearly going to have to play the major role, frankly, in reaching these kinds of goals that we are aspiring to. Now, how do we mobilize private capital? How do we incentivize private capital in a highly different risk environment than anything I think most of us have ever experienced in our lifetimes? When you consider the aftermath, although some might argue that we're still really not out of the woods yet on the pandemic, but when you consider the pandemic and the risks that are associated with trying to finance your way out of that, and then on top of that we have a war in Europe. And in my mind, when I look at the current risk environment, that makes what we're talking about today and how to mobilize private capital, how to reduce the cost of capital, how to de-risk the cost of capital, a very, very unique topic. One that, quite frankly, has been observed already today. The multilateral development banks have not really formed to, and their mandates were not necessarily oriented towards this kind of de-risking. And yet, in order for the private capital that we're talking about, the trillions of dollars that are lying out there, whether in pension funds or other places, you're going to have to find some innovative new approaches. I think one of the great interesting things I've observed over the years now, and I think all of you would agree, we've observed that we've got to motivate private capital to help reach the solutions we know we can achieve, but we've been talking about it now for years, and it shocks me, frankly, that we continue to talk about, oh, we've got to motivate private capital, we've got to get it out there, and yet we have not achieved that. My personal opinion is that one of the reasons why is we in the private sector and we in the financial sector know what it will take. We have to have government step up and take more of a role in de-risking capital, and yet the governments are not getting there. So I think in some ways, and I know this isn't necessarily a financial solution, but we have to motivate the politicians to accept the fact that this is a new world, it's a very high-risk world, and it's going to have to take some political will in order to help these multilateral development banks step up and help us de-risk. There are some short-term solutions that we can talk about in a moment, and then, of course, the long-term solutions where we have to convince the shareholders of, well, let's say, the World Bank or the IMF that really the mandates have to change. But I hope I'll have an opportunity to talk about some of these short-term solutions.
I think thank you very much. May I turn to you, Marc André Blanchet, the Executive Vice President and Head of the GDPQ, Global Head Sustainability, GDPQ Canada, on this subject, on which I'm sure you know a great deal, but he left it dangling when he said that there are some solutions, he has some ideas on how to incentivize private capital flows, because it is clear to everyone that public outlays would be grossly inadequate till you are able to get private capital in. What will it take the sovereigns to take decisions which are appropriate, which would attract private capital flows?
Well, thank you, Mr. Singh, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this great discussion. I want to congratulate India, and I want to also congratulate CII for the way this B20 has been coordinated and put together and implemented. It's, I think, really, I've been involved in some others before, and this one is just extraordinary and exceptional. And what we saw as outcome this morning, and the desire to implement and the focus on implementation is so welcome and so needed. I was co-chair of the infrastructure and transition group, and you know, this morning our chair, Mr. Jindal, came in and talked about you know, the 4 heads that we had, you know, talking about the urging nations and enterprises to collaborate in a way that was never seen before. And then the second was ramping up climate finance, and then doing it in a just and equitable, at the right price for everybody, to make sure that no one is left behind. And so this is a good summary of where we are. I want to talk to you briefly about CDPQ. CDPQ is an institutional investor, a pension fund largely in the province of Quebec. We have a dual mandate. We need to actually give a return for our pensioners. 6 million Quebecers depend on us for their pension. Second, we have another mandate, which is to contribute to the Quebec economies and to the communities we invest in. This is why we believe we deploy constructive capital. But we have to respect the mandate to actually provide a return for our depositors. This is the mandate we have as an institution. And so just keep that in the back of your mind. We are very happy to be here in India. We have more than $7 billion invested in India in all sorts of assets, going from renewable investments to toll roads to private equity and to various buildings and also obviously public markets. We have great partners, and we are here to actually continue to grow. We find India very appealing as an investment location. We have approximately 60 billion of our $430 billion Canadian invested in emerging markets. So I'm giving you this as a background because we are often the #1 fund in the world that that is perceived as being the most aligned with sustainability and ESG criteria and everyone. Another great fund is my friend Dylan from Temasek is also an extraordinary model in the world. That's the background. The issue. In the last 60, 70 years, one of the things that in my mind has changed the most is in whose hand capital is. 70 years ago, Temasek and CDPQ, we did not exist. And, now institutional investors have in their hands more than 2/3 of the investable capital in the world. So we all see, most of us see a role in the solution, but we must do it in respect within the mandates that is given to us, within our fiduciary obligations. And so that's the background for us. Now the challenge that is at hand is fight against climate change and the issue of inequality. A lot of money is needed, the case was made. We signed the Paris Accord and the SDGs in 2015. Since 2015, what has happened? A significant level of increase of investment in infrastructure in developed markets. More or less stable, if not declining, in most of the emerging markets or of the least developed countries and the developing economies. If we continue to do what we've been doing for the last 8 years, we're not going to make it, or 9 years or 8 years, we're not going to make it. So we need to change the way we do things. And so this is the crux. How do we get the risk-return equation right for institutional investors to be able to invest in some of the things? And a lot of the things we need to be doing do not have the proper return or are too risky. And that's the challenge. That's the elephant in the room that we need to deal with. So for the last few years, the private sector, particularly the institutional investors, have been very clear in saying what needs to be done. There are examples in the past that have been done. Just think about the renewable energy. 20 years ago, it was nascent. It was starting. In Canada, for example, it was barely non-existent. What triggered the fact that now in some of our countries, more than 30% is produced by renewable energies like wind and solar? Well, there were some investments made and some subsidies made by the governments offered to the private sector. Some de-risking instruments were put together. Some contracts, some partnerships were put together that we hadn't seen before. And so this is the same kind of thinking what we need to get into to do that. The private sector has identified a few things. First, we need to talk about pools of de-risking instruments. For example, the foreign exchange risk for institutional investors like us is very real. We report our results in Canadian dollars twice a year. So the fluctuation of the currency is very significant for our returns that we have to produce. So foreign exchange risk is one of the risks we need to be talking about. Other risks, like political and other risks, needs to also be tackled. So de-risking instruments needs to be developed. The second thing, a big problem, a big issue for a lot of investors and a lot of the things we need to be doing, like sustainable aviation fuel and other things, is the fact that there's a lot of money that needs to be put very upstream in project preparation, where there's a big market failure for that. So project preparation needs to be put on steroids. The third thing in the discussion that we need to have is the discussion of the reform of the multilateral development banks and everything. Just think about that. The institutional investors are 900 times bigger in terms of capital than the multilateral development banks, all of them put together. So we need the role of the MDBs has been central so far to the deployment of capital in some areas. They've done it very, very well with a lot of success. The problem is the task at hand is so much bigger than everything we've had before. So we need to change, and the fact that none of these instruments have been made or created or adapted to the institutional investors. So we need to develop the partnerships that will actually make it possible for us to actually, in all sorts of ways, partner and de-risk ourselves with the collaboration of the MDBs.
Thank you.
I'll finish on that. One example, the sharing of data. The sharing of data of the MDBs with the private sector would be one big step to actually help us with lowering the cost of capital for us to invest. The MDBs have such a deep experience in many of the markets where institutional investors like us have less. So these are the ideas at the...
Thank you very much. Thanks. I think that those are some brilliant ideas. I must say, under the leadership of the B20 of India, some outstanding papers have been done. I should have referred to them earlier. One of them is a funding mechanism exactly towards the kind of things which you have mentioned. It has also been suggested that if a credible funding mechanism can be created within the MDB family, and you mentioned this huge possibility of pension funds, which looks not so much of exceptionally high rates of return, but wants to minimize risk. So I think that's a kind of a discussion which needs to be followed, or whether the MDBs themselves, acting individually or in tandem, can in some ways be able to entice the opportunity of funds of the kind which you mentioned, namely the pension funds. And undoubtedly the issue of mitigating risk on foreign exchange, first loss guarantee, and some of the other ideas are very worthwhile. And thank you very much, Mark, for making them. As I turn to Dylan Pillay Sangeser, Executive Director or Chief Executive Officer of Temasek, Singapore. Temasek has a great record in terms of what you have done to create great opportunities on infrastructure. And what has been your experience which you share with us? We couldn't share for a more generic application of what can be done better and differently, building on some of the ideas which have come to be able to garner private capital. All yours, Pillay.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. And first of all, let me say I'm very happy to be here in India today to be part of the B20 discussions. Let me just follow up on what Marc-Andre said about investors like Temasek and CDPQ. One of the things I think that makes us quite unique is that unlike CDPQ and others, we're not a pension fund. So we don't hold money for pensioners of Singapore or the workers of Singapore. We're owned by the government, and we own operating assets and companies. We own a company, for example, that operates the major port in Mumbai. Now, we were set up for economic development, but sometime about 20 years ago, we decided we'd become a global investor and not be involved in the economic development of Singapore. What we were required to do was to build our companies into becoming global champions and allow the Singapore economy to develop with private sector money and not have Temasek have an outsized participation in it. So much of what is, so we have permanent capital. It's our money, we decide what to do with it. We account to the government once a year for our performance, and if they don't like us, or if they don't like what we're doing, they can fire me or have me fired by my board or remove my board. So in a sense, we decide what we want to be. And we've agreed with the government that we have three roles. One is to be an investor, the second is to be a forward-looking institution, and the third is to be a generational steward. And so we believe that our role is to make sure that every generation prospers, not just in Singapore, but in countries where we operate. We believe that we have to build with courage, we believe we have to invest in human potential, we believe we have to catalyze solutions, and we believe that we grow with generations. We believe our capital has to be catalytic, financial, social, human, and natural. Because we believe that at the end of the day, if we don't pay attention to all these four elements, we will leave a world, or we will not be able to contribute to a better world that we could leave for future generations. So in terms of being an investor, the most important criteria there is that we have to generate long-term sustainable value. And that means that we have to beat our cost of capital, which today, by the way, is at 9%, thanks to rising interest rates. And that means that when we invest, we have to invest with a clear-minded approach to generating both the financial returns we expect to have and the other returns that we hope to achieve as well, depending on what we're doing. So much of it depends on a risk-adjusted cost of capital in terms of how we allocate our capital across the different geographies. Now, that requires us to take a very, very focused view on what we invest in and what are the outcomes we expect to see from it. We're not there to maximize our profitability because we can take duration risks. And as I said, it's sustainable return over the long term. And that means compounding. So that requires us, we wanted to stay for the long term and to accept that we have a much more broader mandate than would, say, a private equity fund, or for that matter, many other investors. Now, I just want to say one thing about the role of companies in terms of sustainable development. It's not correct to say that sustainable development or investing in sustainable development does not give you good returns. We have seen that happen in many countries we've invested in. Some don't, but some give you very good returns. On a blended basis, in terms of investing in a pool of assets, if you can beat your cost of capital and can generate alpha, well, that's a good return, especially if you can achieve other outcomes, which include social outcomes. I'll give you an example. In terms of a country that has prospered in the last 20 years, and that would be China. Okay? It's true that China has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into what is a middle income type of cost of living, but it didn't do so by itself. It did so because it put in place a framework where it could attract private capital to come in, to be deployed, and to get the outcomes it wanted for economic development and for social development. And that allowed investors to also make money from China, and that encouraged FDI and private investment capital to go in. We have found the same thing in India. We have over $30 billion invested in India between us and our subsidiaries. And why do we do it? It's because when we see the economic framework of India, we can encourage that we put capital to work, we will get a good return over the long term. In 2005, we invested in financial inclusion. At that time, it was not a fashionable thing to do. Our purpose was to invest in the rural areas of India, semi-urban and rural areas of India. So we set up a credit company called Fulton India Credit Company. Before we sold it last year, after 17 years of ownership, it has something like 700 branches in India, especially in priority sector lending. Cost of capital was high, but we believe that at the end of the day, the Indian population would benefit from permissive policies to encourage economic development, to encourage self-sustenance, and we invested. By the way, our best credit were women. Women were the best credit, 0 NPLs that we had. Okay, we had a $3 billion loan book, 0 NPLs. And we made good money. But we eventually sold it, not because we felt we couldn't make better money, but we realized our cost of capital was higher in an India that was de-risking itself. And therefore, we felt that a bank should own it so that the cost of capital to be made available to borrowers would be lower and would enable them to do better, rather than our cost of capital. So if you look at it from that perspective, what is the role of the corporation today? What's the role of investor? Well, the role of investor is to take risks and to get the right return. That doesn't mean that we only take safe risks. And sometimes we have to take a bit of a bet on some of the things. You will not blow up the bank, but certain part of your portfolio can be made available as risk-based capital. So we invest quite a bit of our capital in terms of technology-based solutions for climate change. Things that we don't know can be commercializable, but they represent a clear view that we have to start somewhere, and if investors do not come in to support these potentially innovative solutions to the big problems we have, then who's going to do it? Because all of us have capital, but some part of capital can be given for these risk-based things. And I feel that's what investors need to do. There needs to be a confluence between governments putting in place a very permissive policy framework to encourage the capital to come in, corporations willing to be the test beds for some of these innovations. We have to give encouragement to investors, to entrepreneurs who have the vision and the idea and the gumption to go forward. And we, as investors, have to be the enablers by providing capital for these solutions. Otherwise, we're worse off for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for those examples which you have given, which are exceedingly encouraging. I now turn to Anshula Kant, the Managing Director and the Chief Financial Officer of the World Bank. In the multilateral family, we know that the World Bank Group is the most dominant of within the multilateral banking system. So Anshula, you say what you want to, but do address two questions which I have for you. Three of the earlier panelists, one has talked about a risk return, in some way being in a tolerable zone. The last speaker mentioned about risk. The issue of risk inevitably comes up again and again. As we push you, Anshula, not I, but the world pushes you to enhance your lending and therefore enhance your risk, address the question, what do you believe and perceive to be the appetite of the shareholders for enhanced risk? That's one question. And what can be done in the light of that to meet those expectations of shareholders, and yet for the World Bank Group and multilateral development banks to operate within the system of financial sustainability? That's one question. The second one, do favor us by telling what kinds of innovative capital can be used with technology and experience which does away with this issue of capital in a traditional sense. What I mean is that the record of the multilateral development banks, to give you an example, is an extraordinary one on the quality and success of financial intermediation. Not many may know that the total amount of capitalization of the World Bank is about only $22 billion. Against that, they have successfully lent $900 billion. The leveraging and quality of financial intermediation has been extraordinary. And yet, in sharp contrast, Anshula, $1, which normally gets you $7, as far as private capital is concerned, gets you only 0.6, less than 1. Why has the financial intermediation been so disappointing in the record of being able to harness private capital? Say what you like, but you will do us a favor if you address these two questions also. Thank you. All over to you, Anshula.
Thank you. This is, not full freedom that you've given me. It's a very curtailed kind of flexibility. But first, let me say what I want to say, and then I'll come to answer your questions. You talked about the big gap. There was a mention of $4 trillion this morning, and finally you boiled it down to about $500 billion.
That's what the World Bank says.
Yes. So whatever that number is, it's pretty huge. That's accepted by all. So what I want to say is, just to step back a minute before I come to the private sector conversation, what are we doing to fill that gap? And you talked about the innovative capital instruments. So the first thing we're trying to do is how to sweat our own balance sheet and existing capital base to the maximum. How can we stretch that dollar? Can we increase our risk appetite to leverage more? What are the innovative instruments we can bring in? So, this kind of thinking and conversation has really, has stepped up very significantly after this G20 appointed Capital Adequacy Framework Panel report came out last year. And since then, we have increased our risk appetite to get us to increase our lending capacity by about 50 billion over 10 years already. This happened about a couple of months ago, and currently we are looking at new measures. And with this audience and co-panelists, I do want to share a very interesting, exciting, innovative hybrid capital instrument that we have devised now. And we have approval, sort of quasi-approval from our shareholders. We'll be going to the board again in the next couple of months. This is a capital instrument which does not carry voting rights. It is open to shareholders, it is open to philanthropies, foundations, and I hope everyone is listening here, and to the private sector investors. The difference is, if the shareholders put in the money, We hope to give them a little bit of a lower return so that our cost of funds stays lower. For the private sector, we will expect to pay market-based return. For philanthropies, we may even get it for free, let's see. So we are very flexible on the instrument. We've been in conversation with rating agencies, and we believe we can get equity-like treatment from this instrument so that that $1 of hybrid capital put into the bank will get us to 6 to 8 billion of leverage, Mr. Singh. I hope that's a happy place to be in. And let me say this, the markets notch down hybrid capital rating by 3 to 5 steps, but the fact is a AAA rated entity like the IBRD, when we issue hybrid capital, I don't think it can get safer than that in this class of instruments. So whoever is listening, we are open, our shop is open for that. Then, there are a couple of other instruments which we have created, which are more interesting to the shareholders. It is in their domain. It is a portfolio guarantee platform. Here again, you put in $1, you get an output of 6 to 8 times leverage on that. We are also working, there's something called callable capital that banks like us have, and we are trying to see how we can make that more productive and more leverageable. And before I again come back to the private sector, let me also say this. The past 3 years, I think what has really come to the fore is that countries need to be financially resilient when faced with natural disasters and other kind of crises. There's been such a huge setback. It started with the pandemic and then the macroeconomic crisis, and the food insecurity, which the Honorable Finance Minister talked about earlier. So many challenges the world has been facing. So we've put together a crisis toolkit, and it has 3 very powerful instruments in that. One is a catastrophe insurance product, which actually supports countries in the aftermath of natural disasters without adding to the debt profile. And how we pay for these insurance premiums is also detailed, innovative concept, which I won't go into now. Another thing which we are hoping to take to a board for approval very soon is debt pause clauses. So the really vulnerable countries, if they get hit by, say, an earthquake or a hurricane, whether they can pause their debt repayments for a year or 2 for a while. So that is something which is, again, very much under consideration. The third option is a rapid response option, which is available to all countries, not just the extremely vulnerable countries, where they can repurpose their existing capacities very quickly so that they get immediate liquidity in hand to deal with natural disasters. And we are also, Mr. Singh, if I may say so, mobilizing private capital is not just about de-risking or blending. It is also working with our client countries, and this we do very, very actively, to change policies or amend policies, to put in place frameworks and regulations which can facilitate or make the operating environment more attractive and less risky for the private investors to come in. So this is another area of work that we do, and we've been doing, and we are stepping up on this. But now to come back to the original question. So one is that we are trying to step up our financing capacity based on our own balance sheet. Now the second is, of course, very clearly, the trillions of dollars that are needed are not going to come out of our own balance sheet. There's no way it can happen. We are not going to be able to get that much increased or new capital from our shareholders to be able to deliver this. So we need the private sector to come in. And again, I was just sharing with Mark earlier today that there are a multiple of things that have been tried by MDB like ours and others as well. Whether it is blended finance, whether it is de-risking instruments, partial credit guarantees, partial risk guarantees, there have been transactions that have happened, but they have been small, they have been bespoke, we have not been able to scale. So, that is the challenge facing us, which I think collectively there is let me at least commit to say this, that we are fully committed to solve this problem. Right. Just one last sentence I want to add, and Dilhan is part of the founding members of that. We have, our new president, Ajay Banga, when he came in, he said that let's hear the ideas from the private sector itself. So we've put together something called a private sector investment lab, which is co-chaired by Mark Carney and Shiti Vadera, and it has 15 of the global CEOs as members to suggest and work with us to give us ideas. Chandra is one of them, and so is Dilan. So Back to you, Mr.
Good.
Singh.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Anshula. I think that was a very, very thorough account of the new instruments and the new initiatives which the bank is taking. Over to you, Karan. As they say, Lord Karan Billamoria, which in many ways is a household name in India for various things. We know you for academic attainments, with the association with Cambridge, with other ways in which you have expanded your business. But today, I seek your advice that having heard all of us, and as they say, last but not the least, what would you say are some of the things which can be done to harness private capital, since you have practical experience in this regard, and you have spoken at great length in the House of Lords on this, what would you suggest are the kinds of ways in which we can harness more creatively, imaginatively, and you have heard Anshula, innovatively, private capital?
Thank you very much, NK. And isn't it serendipitous that I follow Anshula? And last month, I was privileged to be back at one of my old schools, the Hyderabad Public School, as guest of honor for the centenary investiture ceremony. And who else is an alumnus of the Hyderabad Public School? The president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga. Isn't it marvelous to have an Indian now as president, and the CFO also an Indian as well? And isn't it amazing that today I was talking to Chris, one of the founders of Infosys, and today his fellow founder, my great friend Narayan Murthy's son-in-law, is Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, an Indian. I mean, this is just terrific. I was privileged to be president of the Confederation of British Industry, the sister organization of the CII, for 2 years, from June 2020 to June 2022. Not only was this a great privilege for me to lead British industry in the biggest crisis since the Second World War, but I was the first person of ethnic minority in the history of the CBI to be president, and from India. So that was something I was very proud of. Not only that, I happened to be president when I was chair of the B7 before the G7, which the UK hosted in June 2021. And I can categorically say, and this is not flattery, this is not exaggeration, that the way India has conducted the G20, the way this B20 is being conducted, hats off to the Prime Minister, hats off to Amitabh Kant, hats off to Chandrasekharan, the President, the Chair of the B20, hats off to Dinesh, the President of CII, and to Chandrit Banerjee of the CII. You have raised the organization of the B20 and the G20 to another level. But going back to the B7, I said this earlier in my question, I want to say it again. I think the B7 is an outdated group. It needs to be the B8, including India, very much in there. After all, India is now the 5th largest economy in the world, and yes, the predictions are that in 25 years it'll have a GDP of $32 trillion. I go one step further, and I say that by 2060, India will be the largest economy in the world. Now, going back to the B7, which I was chairing, one of my speakers was Geeta Gopinath, another Indian who at that time was chief economist of the IMF. She is now the senior deputy director of the IMF and will, I'm sure, go further. And she made a prediction, and this is in the summer of 2021, when we thought we're coming out of the pandemic. She said, you as a country, the UK, will have a V-shaped recovery because you've had a vaccination program that has been leading in the world. And of course, know the wonderful AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. And of course, 2 billion of those doses were manufactured by my friends and fellow Parsis, the Poonawallas of the Serum Institute of India, of which we're very, very proud. She said, that's one reason. Second reason is, you poured in £400 billion to save your economy, and so you should bounce back very quickly. Well, the reality is, it was anything but a V-shaped recovery. The reality is, good old Harold Macmillan, the former Prime Minister of the UK, said, events, dear boy, events. And NK, you said in your introductory remarks, the world is on fire. So you have the pandemic, the worst crisis since Second World War, and then you have the Ukraine war, 24th of February last year that it started. And you've had supply chain issues, we've had energy crises, and we've had inflation, and in many cases rampant inflation, over double digits in the UK, unheard of when we have a target of 2%. How, in Anshula's words, can you be resilient as an economy, as a country, in the face of a world being on fire? And I think government has a big role to play. We've heard from Dylan how Temasek is a well-respected government-owned investment organization that is hugely successful. The UK government, during the pandemic, I fought very hard for this as President CBI. The government was starting to guarantee loans. No bank wanted to lend in that environment. They said, we'll guarantee 80%. I said, you're going to have to guarantee 100%, otherwise the money will not flow. The government ended up guaranteeing loans 100% up to 50 lakh rupees, 50,000 pounds. And those loans saved many, many businesses. When I started Cobra Beer, I got government guaranteed loans without which I wouldn't be here talking to you and my brand wouldn't be a household name in India. Government has a role to be a catalyst for entrepreneurship. NK, you mentioned pension funds. We've just got a new move in the UK to allow pension funds to invest in unlisted, risky investments, a small proportion of their investments to go there. I think that's a brilliant move. And I think the finance minister was spot on when she spoke about growth. And I think Dylan was spot on when he talks about investment with a long-term view, patient capital. If you want to encourage growth, in the finance minister's words, you need to have a tax environment that is attractive. If you have a high tax environment, that will stifle growth. In the UK, we've just put up our corporation tax from 19% to 25%. I have spoken out against that. Next door in Ireland, the corporation tax is 12.5%. That is very attractive. Secondly, you have to have an investment in research and development and innovation. The UK, we're a very innovative country. We invest 1.7% of GDP in R&D and innovation. In India, I think the figure is much lower. Countries like Germany, countries like the United States of America invest 3.1, 3.2% of GDP in R&D and innovation, let alone a country like Israel where it's off the charts. I think we need to encourage investment in R&D innovation. And my final points are climate change. We need green finance. And the UK is a headquarters for green finance. The good thing about green finance is the green revolution, it's a transition, is going to create jobs. And the final point is this: universities, businesses, and government working together is very, very powerful, and we need to encourage that. And a quick example as I conclude, as Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, we've created the world's first retrofitted hydrogen-powered train, which was up and running in Glasgow at COP26. And that was a collaboration between the University of Birmingham, Siemens, and other industry companies, as well as the UK government.
Well,
so I'm delighted to be here. And if I may, NK, the final word is this. There's been a great fear of the world breaking up, of protectionism being on the rise, and of globalization dying. Well, this B20 and this G20 hosted by India is showing that globalization is alive and kicking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We are, I look at the clock, it tells me that there's no time really left for any summing up or anything of that kind. All I can say is that on the broader subject of enhancing the scale of financing, there seems to be great unanimity on the fact that there are credible ways of enhancing private capital flows. There seems to be a great degree of unanimity among the panelists. Wide variety of suggestions have been made, which I think are worth pursuing over the coming months. Inevitable as it is in responding to these challenges, there are creative ways already on harnessing new forms of capital. Karan, you ended your statement on a lot of things which are first for India. Let me end by giving one final word on among the firsts for India. You say this: we were among the first countries to have a legislative enactment for corporate social responsibility as mandatory. If I were to give the idea that if part of the resources of this corporate social responsibility could go towards funding of climate action in this country, it could be a very powerful demonstration of harnessing public-private partnership for overall social good, for global public goods, and for mitigating transboundary challenges. If the world could emulate the Indian experiment of corporate social responsibility, and the Indian one needs to be recalibrated to make sure the reasonable proportion of this goes towards the betterment of society, which is global public goods, transboundary challenges, climate, and others. And if this could be pooled together in some instrument or the other, either under a multilateral entity or a special purpose vehicle or a special entity, it could be one way in which the large unfunded needs of climate can be in some way bridged. If this can be leveraged in the same successful way, as Anshula pointed out, the World Bank has done, and the ability of the multilateral development banks. I end by where I began. The world is indeed on fire for multiple reasons. This panel has sought to address some ways in which innovatively we can, in partnership, forge ahead to fund the necessary kinds of daunting finances needed between now and 2030. That will make for sustainability, for growth, and for inclusive growth. Thank you very much, panelists, all of you, for this interactive session.
Thank you very much, Mr. N.K. Singh and our panelists. May I request Mr. Singh to please do us the honors of presenting small tokens of appreciation to all our panelists. Thank you very much to Ms. Anshula Kant, to Lord Bilimoria, to Mr. Dilhan Pillai Sandrasegara, to Mr. Blanchard and Mr. Johnston, thank you very much. If I could request all of you to please gather for a group photograph towards the front of the dais, please. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for our panel, Actions for Global Economic Recovery. Thank you very much. We're now moving into our last session of the day, which is the ministerial session with the trade ministers. May I request you all to please be seated as we quickly make the changes on the dais for the ministers who will join us, the trade ministers from the G20 and invited countries, for focused dialogues on pertinent issues. Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you to please be seated. For this session, we have simultaneous translation available in 3 languages. I'd like to request you to please remain seated so that the headsets, the audio sets that you need will be provided to you